Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Royal Photographic Society's Historical Group and the latest in the series of collections talks. It's a pleasure this evening to hand over to Gilly Read, the chair of the Historical Group, who will introduce our speaker. Gilly, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Our speaker tonight is Bekah O'Neill, and thank you very much for doing this. Welcome. And she is a UAL graduate and has been a preservation assistant at the British Library, working on the Godwin collection for the past year and a half. She has previously worked at the Science Museum on a major decant project, and prior to that worked for many years in programme information metadata for broadcasters, including the BBC, as well as Discovery and Warner Brothers. So just that short introduction, and over to you, Bekah, and thank you very much.
Hello. Hello, everybody. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks, Gilly, and thanks, Michael. Thank you to everyone for joining tonight. I'm firstly going to give you a brief overview of the British Library and the collections that the Visual Arts Department holds where I work. And then I'm going to show you some of the Fay Godwin collection and hopefully introduce you to some Godwin images that you might not have seen before, and share some discoveries that I've made and talk you through what I've been doing as a preservation assistant, working on the Godwin collection for nearly 2 years now. So the British Library is the National Library of the United Kingdom, and it came into existence in 1973, almost exactly because it's the 50th birthday in the last week, as a result of the British Library Act. And it brings together the collections of various historical organisations, including the British Museum Library, the National Lending Library, the India Office Collections, the National Sound Archive, and the Patent Office Library. And it contains over 170 million items, including books, journals, newspapers, patents, maps, prints, manuscripts, stamps, photographs, sound recordings, digital publications of all kinds, and over 20 billion pages of UK web content. And photographs can be found across all collection areas of the library and span the history of the medium from its earliest years. So our department, the Visual Arts Department, collections include, in the Visual Arts Department, paintings, drawings, prints, photographs, sculpture, and historical furniture. It's primarily related to Asia in its broadest sense, as well as examples of British photography history. And the Visual Arts collection contains over 400,000 photographs, slides, and negatives, with a focus on Asia. However, the collection also includes the Talbot collection, which comprises a major archive of correspondence, notebooks, photographs, and other material relating to the life and work of the British inventor of photography, William Henry Fox Talbot. And also the Kodak Historical Collection, that represents a major resource for the study of the technical, commercial, and cultural development of photography from the late 19th century. And what we're going to discuss tonight, the Fay Godwin collection, that comprises the photographer's complete studio collection, including exhibition and print work prints, contact sheets, negatives, transparencies, cameras, and correspondence with a number of sitters. So just a bit of background about Fay Godwin. She was born in Germany in 1931. Her father was a diplomat and her mother was an American artist. And she lived and was educated in schools all over the world because of her father's job. And she spent a very little time in England, so she didn't have English roots until she was in her 20s. And this photograph here is entitled Self-Portrait, Last Pick on the Saxon Shore Way, 7 AM on Abbots Cliff, Dover. And this is written on the back of the print. Godwin really didn't like having her photograph taken, and this self-portrait tells you everything about her without showing her face. She's got her dog, Honey, by the tripod there, and her equipment. And also a motif that reappears throughout her work, an obsolete defense mechanism, in this case, a redundant Ministry Lookout building, which is a reoccurring theme of human elements within a landscape. So family snaps to landscape is an actual quote that Godwin made in an interview with Val Williams in 1993, which is part of the sound collection at the British Library. There are over 160 interviews with British photographers, which are newly available in the sound section of the British Library website, and that's the link there if you wanted to have a look, listen. They're very long. The one with Fay Godwin's about 5 hours, and they're unedited. But there's some really good ones on there. There's Andy Goldsworthy, Dorothy Bone, all sorts of people. So it's well worth having a look if you're interested. Godwin didn't go to art school to study photography, but she'd always enjoyed taking photographs for her 2 children, and all her early work was portraiture. You can see here a book that she made of photographs of her neighbours' children and their family life. We've got 7 of these books that were made as gifts for family and friends. And we can see in this early stage that the sequence of photographs is important to Godwin, and that's evident in subsequent published work. So Godwin had worked in publishing, and she'd married Tony Godwin, who worked at Penguin in 1961. She'd taken many photographs of authors for various publishers and publications. When her husband left her in 1968, she decided to become a photographer. And she had this leaflet that you can see here, published, printed with her portraits of Peter Van Greenaway, Elizabeth Longford, Eric Ambler, Edward Ward, Margaret Drabble and Hugo Charteris. And she sent this out to publishers, and there's a good response, especially from Faber, who commissioned her to take more photographs of poets in particular. Godwin had always enjoyed walking, and she joined the Rambers Association early on in the 1950s. She also loved and used the Wainwright Guides, which are the 7 pictorial guides to Lakeland Falls by Arthur Wainwright, which were produced in the 50s. And she wanted to do her own series like that, her own pocket walkers guides, but she realised that London Transport already got there and done a series themselves. But her book, The Oldest Road, An Exploration of the Ridgeway, by J.R.L. Anderson and Godwin, was published in 1975. And this was the first in a series of books in this kind of format. They're small and square, and they include maps based on Ordnance Survey maps that you can see here. And the other books in the series were The Drover's Road of Wales by Fay Godwin and Shirley Tolson, which was published in 1977. Romney Marsh and the Military Canal by Fay Godwin and Richard Ingram's 1980. The Whiskey Roads of Scotland by Derek Cooper and Fay Godwin in 1982, and The Saxon Short Way from Gravesend to Rye, 1983, by Alan Sillitoe and Fay Godwin. And throughout her life, Godwin really sought to raise the status of photography. So these books are all co-credited. They're not, you know, by the author with illustrations by or with photography by. They are co-credited, and quite often her name comes first in the books. And the reproductions in the books of Godwin's photographs are not good quality, as they were produced cheaply, as they're not art books, they're walkers' guides. But Godwin would always try and have an exhibition after the book was published, so she could show the prints themselves. And for this book, she did all the subsequent printing herself. The Oldest Road was a success, and in 1975, Godwin was included in the V&A exhibition, The Land, 20th Century Landscape Photographers, which is curated by Bill Brandt and Mark Howarth Booth. And the exhibition included works by Brassai and Cartier-Bresson, and the V&A bought a copy of one of her prints in this Barbary Clump series you can see here. In 1978, Godwin was awarded a Major Arts Council grant for landscape photography, which enabled her to take most of the photographs featured in Land, which was published in 1985. And the photographs are in the exact order Godwin wanted. And here again, we can see the importance of sequence and juxtaposition of work. The double page spreads work really well together. There's, you know, you can see the line here, sort of shadow replicated in the line here. So everything works really well together. And she worked very closely with this, with the graphic designer Ken Garland, who'd previously designed the Traveller's Guidebook series we just saw, and who she continued to work alongside with his design for subsequent books like Our Forbidden Land, excuse me, in 1990, and Edge of the Land in 1995, and Landmarks in 2001. And these, again, are square format books like her previous Ken Garland design series, which is compatible with square format film and 6x6 medium format cameras like the Hasselblad that Godwin was using at this time. And after Land was published, there was an exhibition at the Serpentine in the same year that it was published. Godwin had an extensive portfolio of literary portraits, and we've got these in the library with all the associated correspondence. There's some lovely letters from Ted Hughes to Godwin about the best fish shops in Kentish Town where his sister lived, and Godwin lived in Camden Town, and there's some really funny stuff in there. Marks and Spencer make the best frozen fish, apparently, according to Ted Hughes. And he sat for Godwin on a number of occasions. This was the first time, and this shoot was taken in 1970 in Godwin's garden. And usually she took portraits in the sitter's own home, but on this occasion she was recovering from a knee operation. She had a lot of problems with her knees after a skiing accident. So throughout her life she had problems with her knees. But and at this point in his career, Ted Hughes was about to publish Crow. And so unusually with this shoot, there are a high number of photographs taken, probably because she was immobile after her operation. And there's an interview where she talks about he had to carry her in a nightie into the garden, and she was in a chair and he just sort of walked around her. So she was just immobile and she took loads and loads of photographs. Now, it was at this time that Hughes suggested that she might want to visit Calder Valley, where he grew up, to take photographs of how the region was changing. And this was the first time Godwin had gone up north. So she did go to the Calder Valley, and she was taking lots of landscape photographs. She took photographs of workers at factories, she's got a series of factory workers. And she was particularly interested in working conditions for women and the impact of the Equal Pay Act, which had just been passed in 1972, I think. And she, I heard an interview with her where she said that she asked some of the women workers if she could see their pay packets to see if it had been reflected properly. And they were fine with that and showed her those. So these are two from the Moderna blanket factory. This Wolvercote paper mill, Wolvercote is not in Calder Valley, it's in Oxford, but it is part of her factory series. There's another amazing photograph up here. A few years later, some of the landscape photographs that she'd taken at that time in the Calder Valley were included in Remains of Elmet in 1979. And this is the book that Godwin said she'd most likely to be remembered for. The book was republished in 1994 as Elmet with additional poems and photography. And this project is interesting because it was reciprocal. It wasn't just Godwin illustrating Hughes's poems. He often wrote around her photos. And we can see this from the correspondence. We have all the correspondence from Godwin to Hughes and Hughes to Godwin. And this is, I'm just going to read you an excerpt from a letter from Hughes to Godwin that we've got in the collection. And he says, "The successful method I find is to work from your photographs. And the more I look at them, the more remarkable they seem." And we can see here, this is a copy of the Rainbow Press edition of Remains of Elmet. And if you follow that link there, you can flick through it on the BL website. Rainbow Press was a private press set up by his Ted Hughes and his sister Olwyn Hughes, who's the one that lived in Kentish Town, quite near Fay Godwin. But it's a beautiful book. There's only a few photographs in this edition, but in Remains of Elmet there are a lot more. And then when it was reprinted as Elmet later on, there are even more. In 1994, there are more photographs and more poems as well. I'm going to go on and talk about filters used by Godwin, but you can see from this slide that the top Withens photograph, an orange filter was used. I've just blown that up here and it says all O filter. So this was one of the images included in Remains of Elmet. And she was working on this project at the same time as she worked on a book about the Scilly Isles with John Fowles called Islands. So Doris Lessing sat for Godwin on 3 occasions in 1974, 75, 1980 and 1982. And these contacts and portrait are from 1974, 1975. We can see, I've included the printing notes that we've got alongside the negatives for quite a few of her negatives, that Godwin's really precise about her exposure times. She asked her printer to dodge and burn, and areas to hold back, and others that need more exposure. So it offers a real insight into her use of things like the zone system that she'd learned both from the photographer Robert Gold and from a residential workshop that she went on at Paul Hill's Photographer's Place, taught by Paul Caponegro in 1978. I've just included this because I really like it. I love this letter from Doris Lessing, and she asks Godwin, that she says, "I adore a couple of prints of my beautiful, gorgeous General Butchkin, just little ones, not great big ones, in case he gets lost. They're useful to stick on cat lost adverts, and also because I love him. I just love the idea of Godwin prints being put on lampposts if she lost her cat." I don't think this is actually General Butchkin, I think, because Doris Lessing did a book about cats. I think he was a black and white cat, but she had a lot of cats and she loved cats. So alongside books featuring her landscape work, Godwin also worked on social documentary and photojournalism subjects for books like this, which is called Stories from the Dole Queue, and it was published in 1972 by Tony Gold and Joe Kenyon. And this book consists of case histories recorded from unemployed people discussing issues around the welfare state. And Godwin produced a series on welfare, on all sorts of things, including activities for older people, lunch clubs. And she did this after she'd attended a Chelsea art school class in the late 1960s, early 70s on the redevelopment of Gospel Oak, which was run by the photographer Ewan Duff. And some of her images were used by the Central Office for Information. This book is a really interesting book. There's copies of all her books in the library if you can't get hold of them. I mean, you can pick up copies of things like Land quite cheaply online on Aid Books and stuff, but if you can't, I don't know if this is, I can't find copies of this, but we've definitely got one in the library if you wanted to come and see it. So this is Rebecca the Lurcher, a book that she did in 1973. So this is the 50th anniversary of this book too, as well as the British Library. And it documented the year in the life of Andrew Simpson's lurcher, Rebecca. And it features the famous leaping lurcher photograph. And I just wanted to include these contacts because you can see that there aren't a great many photographs. I mean, I think the thing with Godwin is she waited. She didn't take endless photographs. She waited and got the perfect shot, and that is certainly a perfect shot. And I've just included some more. So this is the book, and these are more photographs of Rebecca sitting on a sofa. They're lovely photographs. And the last one, this is a double page spread, which is quite fun. They've just put the two photographs here that you can see the dog bottom going over the gate and it coming towards you. Great. Oops, sorry. Right, The Oil Rush. This was a book that she did with Mervyn Jones, published in 1976, and it describes the Scottish oil rigs and cities during the oil boom in the North Sea in the 1970s. And this is a quote from Godwin that she writes in the foreword. The words and images in this book are different comments, each reinforcing and adding to the other. Together, I hope they illustrate more than each other could on its own. Several times I was refused permission to make trips to rigs, platforms, pipe-laying barges and other facilities because I'm a woman. All the more thanks, therefore, to the firms which didn't refuse permission, despite the fact. And these photographs were taken during the heat wave in August 1975. And anyone who was around that time, I was at school, and I remember just how hot it was. I can't imagine what it was like being on an oil rig at that time. This is a really interesting book, I think. Here are a few double-page spreads from the book. Again, we've got the book in the library, but you might be able to pick up a copy if you're interested. I love this photograph of the three men sweeping out the mobile homes and the bloke laying the cement there. A couple of my absolute favourite Godwin prints. And the reproductions, again, like the pocket guides, are murkily printed because of the cost. They're cheap books to produce, but prints themselves are beautiful. And we go on and see. This is one of my all-time favourite Godwin photographs. So this is, you can see here that she has actually cropped this photograph. This is unusual. I'm going through the Godwin collection. I've seen very few examples of her cropping, but sometimes she did lop a bit off the horizon or take a little bit off the side. But on the whole, she didn't. But there are multiple prints of this, experimenting with different tonal contrasts. So there's a lot of these. And I just wanted to include, this is how the fisherman photograph is featured in the book, and these are the contact prints. So they're not, I think she just waited till it's just such a beautiful image of him cross-legged and the rope going out before him. It's lovely, but there aren't that many. Again, she just knew what she wanted, and compositionally she got it and just took a little bit off the horizon. We're just going on to talk about other books that she did. She had to earn a living, so she did books like this with Peter Purvis. If anybody is from my generation, then they'll remember Peter Purvis from Blue Peter. So at this time, when this was produced, her ex-husband had died in 1976. And his estate was held up for many years, and she had money issues, and she was also diagnosed with cancer that same year. And so she decided she wanted to work more outdoors for her health and do a lot of walking, and not do the kind of welfare, Equal Pay Act, social documentary kind of work that we've been looking at, that she previously done. And it was at this point she really got into landscape, and she was in her 40s at this point. So these are some of her cameras, which you can see we haven't rehoused. We're just looking at boxing them up now. This one was actually lent to the Science Museum. So this one, the Hasselblad on the left, has been rehoused, but these other ones are just in the boxes as we got them. But we have, if you want to see her in action using a Hasselblad, someone has recorded the South Bank show, where she was the first photographer to be featured in a full-length episode in 1986, and someone's recorded it from Italian television. It's all up there on YouTube. It's just terrible quality, but you can see her lugging this great big Hasselblad and the tripod around, taking landscape photographs. And I mentioned before that she had problems with her knee, and that she'd also, she had cancer, and later on in life, she stopped using these heavy cameras and worked more with 35mm and close-up macro work and autofocus cameras, and 1000 ASA films, that kind of thing. But cameras that we've got in the collection are these on the right-hand side, these box of Leicas, and this Leica M6 in the middle. And she used Leicas for early portraits. Also, we've got various filters and light meters in the collection, and she did use a lot of square format film cameras like Hasselblad's, and her first ever camera was a Rolei. But on this contact sheet, you can see which filters she's used, and sometimes on some of the contact sheets, you also get a note she's put of the focal length that she used. Now with the filters, some of which you can see here in a box that haven't been rehoused yet, an orange filter I think seems to be the one that crops up the most in this contact sheet that I've put here. These two contact sheets, she's written it out, but quite often it's just O or R or Y for orange, red and yellow. And early on she did seem to use green more, but so to bring out the texture, and but red at this time she seemed to use for dominant skies, heightening clouds, that kind of thing. Also, I mean, she did write quite a lot of notes and things on the back of prints and contact sheets, and there's some sort of notation used on the back of prints and printing notes to instruct whoever was printing her work. So this is another contact sheet. You can see what she's written on the top left. 1 and 2 no filter, 3 or 4 red, 7 red, 8, 9 orange, 10 red, 11, 12 orange. We've got over 6,000 contact sheets in the Godwin collection, along with nearly 7,800 negative sheets and 14,000 snappy snap prints. And some negatives have corresponding printing notes, as we saw with the Doris Lessing, with instructions on them. Now going on to her work in colour, and although many people think of Fay Godwin as a black and white landscape photographer, she always wanted to be known as a documentary photographer. And from the time she was given a fellowship from the National Media Museum in Bradford, which is now the National Science and Media Museum, from 1987 to 1980, she began to work much more in colour. There was a film made of Godwin's Bradford series that was shown at the IMAX in Bradford and designed again by Ken Garland, who she worked with throughout her life, but unfortunately there's no catalogue or book. But Godwin did include some of these images in her book Landmarks. So this one on the left is not in Bradford, but it's another colour image, which is a lovely one. So this is some more work in colour. Before the Bradford time, she'd worked in colour in places she'd visited, like Hawaii, where she visited in 1988, 1992 and 1995, and also New Zealand, where she did a 6-week workshop tour in 1990. These two photographs that I've just taken photographs of them. They're from the Snappy Snap work. So she had these processed snappy snaps. We have nearly 15,000 of these in the collection, and a lot of these are still held in their original pouches, and I've just included at the top right there what she'd write on the pouch, so the camera that she used, the film she used. And these are amazing, beautiful prints. Godwin's later work was more 35mm and macro work, as we can see in this Glassworks and Secret Lives book that she had published, which is a small square book, square again, in 1999, which she was self-published. I think she was very disappointed that her colour work wasn't better received. I think people were, just thought of her as a landscape photographer, but hopefully I'm trying to show that there's more, much more to her than that. Also in the collection, we have a series of never publicly displayed artworks, which include mixed media collages and paintings and worked over photographs, as in this instance, over her famous photograph of Meal Moore in Glencoe from 1989. She produced these in various workshops. She did go on a lot of workshops and taught at them as well during the 90s and early 2000s, as well as at her painting studio at Pet Level. But she did say, if you listen to her Desert Island Discs appearance, she said She loved painting, and her mother was an artist after all, but she never wanted to show them to anyone. And Godwin had a major retrospective in 2001, Landmarks at the Barbican, which showcased her running themes of ecological crisis and privatisation of land, which was particularly evident in her book Our Forbidden Land, which was published in 1995, which won the first Green Book of the Year award and was instrumental in changing the right to roam legislation. And she was also president of the Ramblers Association from 1987 to 1990, and she was the first woman and the first person from the arts to hold the position. And then she became life vice president. Godwin died in 2005, and the collection was donated in lieu of inheritance tax and accessioned to the British Library in 2007. As I mentioned before, the collection consists of the entire contents of her studio, including prints in multiple sizes and copies. At some points in her career, she was printing in around 5 different formats. We've got the mounted exhibition prints from exhibitions like Barbican exhibition and other exhibitions. Fine art prints, proof prints, snappy snap prints, negatives, contact sheets, printing notes, and correspondence with sitters like Doris Lessing, Philip Larkin, and Ted Hughes, as well as her cameras, slides, maps, marked up copies of all her books and artwork, like we've just seen, including paintings, prints, and experimental work. So there are currently 11,000 items catalogued on the system to access, but the collection is far larger than this. We don't know the actual total yet. I'm guessing it's more like 70,000, but maybe more. But I'm still in the midst of cataloguing it. So maybe in a year I'll have a final total. The preservation assistant, my post, has been a contractual post since 2019. Jodie Butterworth, Melanie Taylor, and Francisco Manuel Perez Garcia were in the post before me. We've also had the help of Geraldine Alexander, who was one of Godwin's personal assistants for 2 years towards the end of her life. So this is a slide here of the basement, one of the basements in the British Library, and these are all Godwin housed prints. So the collection needs to be sorted and rehoused. So these, the top photograph is how they came to us in the original boxes. And then I need to rehouse it into conservation grade Seacole sleeves and A4 and A3 custom made for larger exhibition prints, Buckram and Fay's boxes. You can see the Buckram blue boxes on the right there in the basement picture. And this bay here in the basement contains about 43,000 photographic prints, and there's a lot more to come. I'm working through each box. The first thing to do is an audit and check the order, going by her original external reference numbers, add a new reference number on reverse in pencil, indicating the file and item level. Then an image of the original box needs to be retained and inserted into the front of the rehouse material. Any information written on the original housing. So there's lots of writing around some of these boxes. So that needs to be recorded on an interleave sheet. And we use interleave sheets to show how Godwin originally grouped her photographs together. So, for example, if prints were originally batched together in non-archival materials like glassine envelopes, the interleave sheets would indicate this in the new housing, how they were divided. And this is the condition that some of the snappy snaps came in just in plastic bags, not in pouches, or some were just like huge cardboard boxes filled with snappy snaps that needed to be sorted. We retain any post-it notes or notes that Godwin has written that were written on non-archival materials, and we place these in Seacole sleeves next to the print, as well as any marked up notes or Godwin's notes to her printer. And then each print needs to be stamped by the stamping and finishing team at the library with a green stamp on the back, which indicates it's a donation and show the date of accession. And each box needs its own label. We get a foil backed conservation grade label ordered from the finishing and stamping team again, and then it needs to be catalogued. So if you want to access what's already been catalogued, if you find this screen, if you go to British Library Catalogues and Collections, and then you go down to Explore Archives and Manuscripts and type in Fay Godwin, as here, you can see what's already been catalogued. As I said before, there are about 11,000 photographs, and many more are be coming over the next year or so. As I mentioned earlier, there are over 160 interviews in the sounds category on the British Library website, including the 5 hours of a Godwin interview in 1993 with Val Williams. So that's the link for that there. And the Fay Godwin Desert Island Discs interviews there, which is well worth a listen. If you want to look at some lovely Fay Godwin images online, you can go to Images Online on the BL website, and there are nearly 500 Fay Godwin photographs on Images Online. And to access what's already been catalogued so far, the Godwin Archive, go to the Explore Archives and Manuscripts page again and see, and if there aren't any images on Images Online that you'd like to see, you can make an appointment with a reader's pass and come in and see them. And this is the email to contact if you want to come in and view some prints in the print room of the library. Just like to say thank you for listening. Sorry, my voice has gone a bit weird. Just finishing off with a couple of my favourite Godwin prints there. And that's the end of the presentation. Thanks,
Bekah. That was really, really interesting and so nice to see some of Fay Godwin's work again after, well, for me, it's been a long time, and it's made me realise again how important she was and remains, you know, even more so in some respects in terms of her work around the environment and conservation. So thank you for sharing that. We've got some questions that have come in. So if anyone else has any questions, please drop them into the chat and we'll pick up with them. The first question that's come in was, how did the collection come into the British Library? It doesn't seem the obvious place for it.
Well, I think it was, it came in lieu of inheritance tax, but I think it was the literary connection. So all the correspondence that we have from with Ted Hughes and Doris Lessing and Philip Larkin, and I think it was that made, you know, their family donate it to the British Library rather than anywhere else.
And another question here is, do we know which other photographers Fay Godwin admired during her lifetime?
Yeah, I mean, there was, she went on a lot of workshops, and Paul Hill, you know, is a contemporary, and she liked him. She also liked people like Jen Southam and Raymond Moore. I think, you know, Raymond Moore was a contemporary landscape photographer. I mean, people like Martin Parra, the younger generation, I know she came across him in workshops as well. But definitely from the interviews that I've heard with her, she definitely mentioned Jen Southam, and she liked his work a lot.
And there's a question from Lynn asking, will the British Library be arranging a major exhibition of Fay's work? Yeah, I do hope so. I mean, it's got a long way to go before it's all been catalogued, but I'm sure there will be at some point. I couldn't say when in the future, but I really hope so, yeah. Perhaps as a follow-up from me on that one, does the library loan works from the archive? And if so, are there any places where people could see any of her work at the moment or in the near future? Yeah, there's an exhibition. We've just lent a few works to the Barbican, who are having an exhibition at the end of this year. I think it's October, and that's about women photographers and the environment. We've lent about 5, I think, or 6. Photographs there, but otherwise, I mean, other places that hold Fay Godwin's, the MPG have got a lot of the portraits, and the V&A have the Barbary clump that I showed earlier. They have about 70, I think, on there. The Arts Council have some.
various places. I think there's places in Copenhagen that have, I don't know what they have. The National Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh have some of her work. But yeah, I think at the library we have most of it.
Great. I think Gilly, do you have any questions at all? You're still on mute, Gilly. There we go. Okay.
Am I all right?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Oh dear me. Anyway, yes, thank you very much. That was amazing. I had no idea there were so many images. I do remember seeing an interview with her. It might have been from the place in Bradford, I don't know, but I do remember watching it and watching her being ever so careful about how she took her photographs. So I do remember that, but I do like them very much indeed. So I shall have to try and find the one that I've got at the land somewhere. I've got this Forbidden Land, I found that. But anyway, thank you very much for that. That was great. Very well worth waiting for. But it would be good if there was a big exhibition that one could go and look at all these things together and just think about them quietly. Yeah.
Well, as Bekah said, her books are available and you can find them fairly easily on A-Books, particularly some of the later editions, which are perhaps less collectible by photo book collectors. So do look out for those because they're well worth acquiring. So firstly, Bekah, thank you so much to you and your colleague for presenting the slides and giving us the insights into how you're working on the collection. It was so interesting and as I said earlier, so good to see Fay's work being looked after so well, and what a wonderful job you have to do that. Yeah. And Gilly, thank you so much for arranging this evening. We're looking to arrange further talks in this series in the autumn. The first one will be in September, which will look at the Reba collection of architectural photographs. So that should be really exciting. So thank you to our audience for joining us this evening. Again, thank you, Bekah. Thank you, Gilly, and good night, everyone.